Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. I am your host, Austin Render. And our co-host, Dalton Shetler, is with us as well. Dalton, thanks so much for joining us. Fighting through some internet issues today is what I've heard.
It actually, just because they knew the Dribble Drive podcast was getting ready to get started, they just got it restored. So we're in good shape.
I tell you what, you would have no idea. Your picture's coming in crystal clear. The audio's just fine. You'd have no idea there's any issues there.
I don't know. Maybe listeners would appreciate it being laggy, at least from visual preferences.
Yeah, exactly. We should throw some more in there, a little bit more. I'll move your screen in and out of. I've got control over it. Yeah, I'll move you around the box on the live show. No, we're having a great time. How was your past week with the Spartans?
Michigan State women's basketball got back on the right track in this past week, and they had a tough stretch where they bounced back into Big Ten play at Maryland. Maryland was a tough one. They were down 17 in that game, tied it up with a handful of minutes left, ended up dropping shortly after that at Nebraska in what was a tough game where they just couldn't quite get their footing. They lost the second quarter 28-12, and everything just unspooled from there. I mean, they made a comeback effort, but just couldn't get over the hill. But this past week, Austin, it started with a win over a hot Washington team at home. And then Michigan State was able to go on the road, didn't play their best ball, but they gutted out a win at Rutgers. But this last game, this is what has a lot of folks excited. Michigan State had maybe its best game of the season at Illinois, beating the Illini 86-68. Theron Halleck had 26, a new career high for her. Grace Van Sluten had 24. We saw the Grace that everybody knew was there this whole time, and it finally got unleashed. Unfortunately for Illinois fans, it came against the Illini, but Michigan State played really well here recently.
Yeah, and that was one of the more impressive games, which we'll certainly talk about, that win in Champaign. Don't forget to like us, subscribe, download the episodes, give us a 5-star rating if you're so inclined. We appreciate all of that. It goes a long way for us. We are live on the YouTube channel, the Back Home Network YouTube channel, every Tuesday, usually at noon. We had to push things back. We're going to be pushing. We might be pushing next week back, Dalton. I've got a red eye back Monday night into Tuesday morning.
You and I schedules, man. It's always up in the air.
We'll see what happens next Tuesday. We're scheduled to get back in Bloomington at 5 a.m. Tuesday morning. So might be sleeping through the noon Eastern live show, but we'll figure that out when we get there. But thanks so much to those of you who are watching live. Leave a comment in the chat if you have any questions. Dalton and I will try and get to those as we go through the show here. Let's talk some basketball, Dalton. Let's start with the fresh off the press AP poll from yesterday. A few changes in the Big Ten. We're looking at the top three staying the same. UCLA number 1, USC number 4, Maryland number 8. Now that, keep in mind, was before Maryland's game yesterday, where they were on the wrong side of a drubbing to Texas. Ohio State drops 3. Losing on the road at Penn State, which we're going to talk about because that was the big shocker from the week in the conference. Michigan State and Minnesota both jump up 1. Similar to what we talked about when Maryland lost to USC, that they didn't punish the Terps. They did not punish the Gophers for losing on the road in an extremely valiant comeback effort that the Gophers put on there. They fall, but they keep them in the rankings. And then we got to talk about that Northwestern game that they played, because that was wild. I know you were playing while that was happening. Yep. I was listening to Justin talk us through that one, and my gosh, that was wild. Then Michigan jumps into the rankings again at number 24. Nebraska is just on the outside looking in as they try to crack back into the top 25. Do you want to start? Where do you want to start, Dalton? Because there's a lot we can go for here to start this thing.
Well, I think, to me, the biggest spot to start is with Maryland, because you mentioned it was a drubbing, and full transparency, I had some things with work going on. I didn't get to watch the game in real time, but I looked at the score at one point and saw it was 39-14 Texas. I said, woof. Yeah. Put it down, continued on with what I had to, pick the phone back up, and it only got worse from there. Now, before that game, it was announced that Bree McDaniel, who's one of the better players on this Maryland team, averaging 10 points a game, one of their best outside shooters, she's out for the season with a torn ACL. So heading into it, you're like, what do they look like maybe without Bree McDaniel? But then during the game, it was reported, and Maryland actually posted that Cheyenne Sellers would not return for the rest of the game, suffered a knee injury. Now, I don't know if you've seen anything, Austin. I tried looking actually before we went live. I haven't seen any more updates on Cheyenne Sellers, but Cheyenne Sellers, matter of fact, she's Big Ten Player of the Week this past week for her incredible efforts. But no Bree McDaniel, and wondering what the status of Cheyenne Sellers is. To me, I think the biggest point of conversation might be the Maryland Terrapins.
I think that's a great point. And I put a question mark next to this because there were a ton of players on our sheet for Player of the Week. And I thought you could go with what the Big Ten did, which is Cheyenne Sellers putting up just remarkable numbers in that Minnesota game. 27 points, 9 rebounds, 7 assists. And then she plays just 14 minutes, suffers that apparent knee injury, and we do not know her status. And that's really important, Dalton, because Maryland's in just a grueling stretch of basketball right now. They had to play USC. They had to play Minnesota. They had to play Texas. Now this week they get Ohio State on the road and UCLA at home. The toughest stretch of games anybody has this week certainly is with the Maryland Terrapins, and you're doing it now, we know, without Bree McDaniel. And when is Cheyenne Sellers going to be back? So it takes a whole different spin on this top 4 conversation in the Big Ten, because this is the first time we're going to see some of these teams consistently start to play, because you're going to get Maryland to play 2 of them. You're going to get Ohio State going out to LA at the beginning of February. So we're starting to get into this. Okay, everybody's going to start to play each other. But this could really open the door, Dalton, for teams like Nebraska, for teams like Michigan State. Pulling up the Big Ten standings here, you look at Nebraska, Minnesota, Michigan State, all sitting there 1 game back of both Ohio State and Maryland. Not only do Maryland's injuries open this up, but Ohio State dropping, and I don't mean this in a bad way to Penn State, but just a head scratcher on the road at Penn State, a team that had not won a game yet in the conference season. And Ohio State puts up 59 points. Now, we should know Jelani Cambridge did not play in this game, which obviously makes a big difference. She had 27 points in their most recent game before that against Wisconsin. But this was a head scratcher. I was doing a game during it, and I get back home and I look at the scores, and I think it was a triple take of just looking at this several times. They got out rebounded by Penn State 39-21. 21 rebounds, Dalton. You do not see that very often. So with that mixed with the Maryland injuries, now their loss to Texas obviously doesn't impact these standings, but this week certainly could. All of a sudden, these teams 5 through 7, and you could throw Oregon and some of those 4 and 3 teams in there as well. The door becomes a little bit more ajar for some of these chasers to get into the thick of things.
And I think that's maybe the best way to say it, because, Austin, you and I have been of the belief that USC and UCLA, they're the most talented teams. They're the best teams in the Big Ten, but Ohio State and Maryland were right there, and we had them kind of in a group of 4, but now we're seeing kind of a continental shift where 3 and 4 are kind of breaking away, and there's a gap now between 1, 2, 3, 4, and the rest. But that 3-4 is getting, I think, dangerously close maybe to that 5 through 7 class that you're talking about. And the Penn State one was wild to me too. So again, we had a game as well. Didn't get to see it, just saw the score, 62-59. Couple things alarming. One, you mentioned it, the rebounds. Penn State out rebounding Ohio State by 18. It seems insane. And the other thing too, Austin, when you look at Penn State, it's a team that, I mean, you mentioned this was their first Big Ten win of the season. They were ranked last in the conference when it came to taking care of the basketball. They averaged 20.5 turnovers a game. Ohio State was able to get that out of them. And again, heading into it, Ohio State and Michigan State, I would say, are the 2 teams in the Big Ten that play full court, get after you the entire 40 minutes. They want to extend the defense and cause some turnovers. So heading into it, you kind of circled it and said, well, that 20 might go up a few more. Penn State still costed up right around the average, but Ohio State couldn't take advantage of it. And the other alarming thing to me, Austin, was the second and fourth quarter. I'm looking at it now on the screen just off to the side. Ohio State had 9 points in the second quarter, 8 points in the fourth quarter. again, I didn't get a chance to see it because we were working and covering other Big Ten games. But that to me, I just stared at and said, how does that even happen?
Yeah. And only 8 free throw attempts in the entire game for Ohio State, a team that is usually pretty aggressive. I mean, when you think of Cody McMahon, you think of a downhill guard.
Yep.
And sometimes that's to her detriment. I think she's improved that this year in terms of the charges. But just shocking to see that score. And give credit where credit's due. Penn State made shots in this game. 7 of 15 from 3. They're one of the worst three-point shooting teams and one of the lowest volume shooting three-point shooting teams in the conference. They go 7 for 15, 47%. Jayla Oden has had a quiet, really good season for Penn State. 13 points for her off the bench. Gabby Elliott was solid. Gracie Merkel grabs a double-double, kind of winning that battle with Asia Petty. And Mariah Murray gets back to her way. She's been pretty quiet here in conference play. 4 3-pointers for Mariah Murray. And that you mentioned the 20-9 second quarter is just crazy. Penn State flipped that thing on a dime, and all of a sudden, boom, we got a ball game at halftime. And again, give Caroline Krieger and that Penn State team a ton of credit. And it just shows you what every coach has said all season long. There is no off night in the Big. And I don't know if Ohio State was looking ahead to the Maryland game, but they got caught. And Penn State, this is one of those wins that could separate you from, we talk about 1 through 4 being kind of its own clique. 15 through 18 have been their own clique, and even really 14 through 18. So a win like this for Penn State is huge as you try to make sure you can be in Indianapolis that first week of March.
And especially since you got it against one of these teams, right? A team at the top of the Big Ten, because you still have to play some of the other ones. And for the context, I mean, you talked about it, but Penn State was one of 4 Big Ten teams that were winless in conference beforehand. Northwestern, Purdue, and Rutgers. Thanks for flashing it back up because Rutgers wasn't coming to mind. Those 3 still winless. Wisconsin, you mentioned that 14th team. They have the 1 win. They were drubbed by Nebraska recently.
Seven straight losses for Wisconsin since they beat Rutgers, which if you're in that 14 through 18, you got to beat each other because that seems to be where it's coming from. But yeah, Wisconsin lost 91-60 last night to Nebraska.
And those last 3 teams, I mean, you and I have talked about it, Austin. Those teams do not make the Big Ten tournament this year under the new format. So that's something to watch kind of play out. But I got to be honest, because I'm with you. I was just as shocked. I don't know if Ohio State was looking ahead to Maryland, and it was kind of the classic or stereotype trap game that fell and ensued for the Buckeyes. But Penn State's next coming to the Breslin Center in East Lansing, and Michigan State's paying attention because that was one that certainly is a headline grabber.
Yeah, big week for Penn State. You mentioned they're on the road at Michigan State, and then they get Rutgers on Sunday, which again, when you're in that 14 through 18 range, and they're going to play each other here coming down the stretch, those are the games you got to have. So that'll be an interesting one on Sunday. Northwestern, there's a bit of intrigue with them right now because they did not make the trip to Los Angeles because of the wildfires. Penn State did. They played their games. Now, how do you make up 2 LA games in this extremely chaotic final 5-6 weeks of the Big Ten season? That's the question the Big Ten offices have to figure out now. Is there a forfeiting on the table? Do they have to make 2 trips to Los Angeles? There's going to be a lot here because if they don't make those games up, Dalton, that impacts the top of the conference with USC and UCLA both missing a game, but it impacts the bottom of the conference with Northwestern potentially avoiding both LA schools, which I think we would all agree on paper that's probably 2 losses for Northwestern. And so there's going to be an interesting little song and dance they're going to have to play here in the Big Ten of trying to make those games up. But give Northwestern a lot of credit. They really should have had Minnesota on Sunday. They had a 16-point lead early in the 4th quarter, about 8 minutes to go. Don Plitzwaite calls a timeout, and they just go surging the rest of the way, and they come back and win. And Minnesota sneaking up there. Where do you want to go next? What about – let's talk Nebraska. That game on Thursday, I know you got to watch it. I was working during it. I went back and watched it, and it was just fantastic. First off, freshman of the week is Britt Prince because she was sensational in this fourth quarter of just an awesome game. Our game of the week, Nebraska 87, Iowa 84 in overtime, is a rivalry game. We know it carries a lot more than just a Big Ten matchup. These two teams do not like each other. They want to beat each other. And for Nebraska to go into Iowa City, I don't care what type of season Iowa is having. That is a really difficult place to play. And Britt Prince hits the huge three that ties the game up inside the final minute. And then just stones, knocks down 2 free throws to send the game to overtime. And then Nebraska, I believe, held Iowa over 3 minutes without a field goal there in the overtime period and kind of walked away with it. But the end of regulation was absolutely bonkers. And that was happening at the same time that the Hoosiers were playing Illinois. So I didn't get to watch it live. But you texted me afterwards. You were like, that game was insane. So take us through it as somebody who got to watch it.
I was going to say, I thought I might have even used the word cinema. Like it was just unbelievable theater between Nebraska and Iowa because from, I think, the last 3 minutes, I think it was around 3 minutes left in the game, we just went possession for possession, bucket for bucket, and it was an extremely well-played game. And everybody just was hitting shots. I mean, you mentioned Britt Prince, and to me, I completely agree. That is the freshman of the week because she hits those big shots, but also, Austin, 22 points, 7 rebounds in this win, 5 assists, 6 steals for Britt Prince. 6 steals. She did it all over the floor. She hit 5 threes in this game. But the other thing, too, is people may not know, especially if they were working and didn't get a chance to see, Alexis Markowski fouled out in this ball game. Yeah. And a lot of it became on the shoulders of Britt Prince, and she carried the weight to a win against Iowa. As you mentioned, you set the stage, a rivalry game, a loud atmosphere. Britt Prince looked anything but a freshman in this win. It was an incredibly sensational performance, and that was a gutty win for the Huskers.
Yeah, I mean, just one of those wins where you're like, all right. I mean, you and I have talked about it, and I think I even talked about it weeks ago on the podcast, and I was waiting for Nebraska because we know the preseason expectations, and then you lose Natalie Potts to the injury, and you just don't look the same. And then they beat Michigan State, and then they go to Iowa and win. And just very, very confident looking bunch right now. They dominate Wisconsin last night. And you look at the standings and you're like, whoa, they're 6-2. Mm-hmm. And this team is right there contending for a Big Ten title if there's a slip up at the top of the rankings. And so it is extremely intriguing. And you think about those 2 losses, they're just to UCLA and USC, which is probably going to make it harder for them to get up there and win the conference. But in a resume comparison, you're thinking, man, they haven't lost to anybody in the conference but the top 2 teams in the league. And they're going to get their crack at Ohio State this week, which is an extremely intriguing matchup in Lincoln on Sunday. But I was so impressed. And I went back, and BTN Plus has the condensed games that you can watch where it's just like all the buckets essentially. And I kept looking at the time as they kept changing buckets in the fourth quarter. And I'm like, man, there's not a lot of time coming off in between these clips. Like, this is very clearly a possession and then another possession. Yeah. And it wasn't like, oh, this bucket happened with 6 minutes and then this bucket happened with 3 minutes. Like, no, it was like 4.5 minutes, 4 minutes, 15 seconds, 4 minutes, 2 seconds, 3 minutes,
just not edit it,
back and forth.
They could just not edit it. Just leave the original because it was just that quick. I'm telling you, I sat there and there was another game on. I want to say it was on the men's side of the Big Ten that was in overtime at the same time. It might have been Minnesota, Michigan.
I think it was Minnesota, Michigan. Yep.
And so I have a 2 TV setup so I could try to watch as much as I can. And both of those were happening at the same time. And I was overstimulated. It was like, intoxicating. Yeah, right. Like it was intoxicating Big Ten basketball. But I mean, that's what you and I have talked about. We expect a lot of those types of nights throughout the Big Ten this season. That was one of them. And a big part thanks to Nebraska. You mentioned that game with Ohio State. I find this pretty interesting, Austin, coming up for Nebraska because we mentioned 2 teams that play similar in the Big Ten, I suppose you could say, again, is Michigan State and Ohio State, right? Because of the full court pressure. They rely so much on turning you over and getting easy buckets. the other way. Nebraska was able to, in that second quarter handle the pressure of Michigan State quite a bit. Now, they did a lot of it too because Jocelyn Tate got in foul trouble for the Spartans. And without her, things kind of transitioned in that game where it's not the same defensive attack for Michigan State when she's not out there. I'm curious to see if Nebraska can kind of hold serve of Ohio State's pressure. And if they can, I think Nebraska's got a really good shot at maybe picking off another win against the Buckeyes, which would really be saying something. When you're talking about the resume comparisons of Nebraska with others, I mean, that really elevates them in what they've done this season.
Again, to put the standings back up for the people watching, Nebraska wins that game, they vault into the top 4.
Mm-hmm.
And Nebraska has the whole week off now. They played yesterday. They will have the week off now. And all of a sudden, you're looking at a team right there that is definitely in position to make some noise here coming up with Ohio State coming to town on Sunday. On the flip side of that matchup, Dalton, Iowa, tough stretch for the Hawkeyes right now. They have now lost 5 straight games, which is hard to believe. And most recently, a 50-49 loss to to Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
And a game that they had in their hands and they kind of coughed it up in the fourth quarter. So you look at the standings right now. Iowa's sitting at 2-6. And I know you're probably with me. I don't have a lot of concern that they're going to fall below that red line. That's not really in the cards, I don't think. Those losses are to good teams. They've lost to Indiana. They've lost to Maryland. They've lost to Nebraska. They lost to Oregon. Like, these are good teams they're losing to. But the broader conversation is the NCAA tournament. And I think it's fair to say right now, I don't know if Charlie Cream has put out a new bracketology today. I think it's usually Tuesdays or Wednesdays he puts those out. But, yeah, how about 10 hours ago? Here we go. Let's see where he's got them. Iowa is the last team in the field right now.
Wow.
And I know we talked about it last week. I sent you that picture where, like, all the last 4 byes were all Big Ten teams.
Yeah.
That's almost the case again in this one. You've got Minnesota, Oregon, and Illinois in the last 4 receiving byes. And then the last 2 teams in the field are Washington and Iowa. So 5 of the final 8 teams in the field, according to Charlie Cream, are Big Ten teams. He still has 13 Big Ten teams in the tournament. But Iowa's still going to host USC. They're still going to host UCLA, and they're still going to go to Ohio State. So there's still opportunity for Iowa to get some big marquee wins in their schedule. They're also going to go to Nebraska in that return trip. But they're just not playing, and it's totally fair to have a new coach and to lose maybe the best player to have ever played and to not have the same results. But it has just been a little bit surprising how quickly the wheels have started to spin here over the last couple weeks.
Well, and what I find interesting about it, Austin, is you give the context, right? Like the standard was put in a pretty ridiculous place, right? The expectations and everything, just because of the run they've had in recent times of being national runner-ups 2 times in a row, and what Caitlin Clark brought to the game in terms of frenzy and play. Like there was so much hype. Of course, it couldn't quite repeat that, right? Yeah. But what I think we find interesting is, I mean, you mentioned lose 5 in a row. They're 2-6 in the Big Ten. What I really have examined, Austin, is we've mentioned the Nebraska loss. You lose into overtime to the Huskers. You lose this last time out against Oregon by 1 point. You lost at Michigan State by 2 points. You lost against, Illinois by 5 points. So a 2-score ball game. It's a lot of close losses that have stacked up for Iowa. Yep. It's not like they're far off, because we've talked about, I mean, again, in the Big Ten, just about any given night you're playing against an NCAA tournament team when you're playing in the Big Ten Conference. If we're talking about 67% of the conference maybe being in the Big Dance, which again is ridiculous. But the point nonetheless is, it's really interesting to me for a team that has as much experience as Iowa does. And of course, they lost Gabby Marshall. Of course, they lost Kate Martin and Caitlin Clark. But Hannah Stolke's been here. Sydney Falter's been here. Addison O'Grady in a role has been here. And they really are relying on some of the underclassmen like Aaliyah Guyton to step up in spots. And again, they're coming up just short on the scoreboard in one-score games. That part is a really interesting dichotomy so far in Iowa's season.
Well, and Hannah Stalky is injured, so we should mention that. I
Yeah,
don't believe
thank
she
you.
played in that Oregon game. So they've had Taylor McCabe start in her place. It just it feels like a little bit they're stuck between upperclassmen and freshmen on who is going to get the big time minutes.
Yeah.
And I noticed against Indiana and the same thing against Oregon. When crunch time came around, it was Aaliyah Guyton running the offense for Iowa. And I think she's a star, and I think she's going to be a star in this league. That the behind the back pass that she had, saving it out of bounds against
Oh,
Nebraska, was insane.
that had to be a
Uh,
top 10 play, right? I didn't see the
I
next day,
didn't
but it
see it,
had to be.
but had to be. But I think they're just kind of stuck in this, like, okay, do we run with the people who have gotten us here and helped get us here? Or do we run with this top 10 recruiting class with McDonald's All-Americans and stars? And I think they're just trying to figure that out. And I think it's only fair that we give Jan Jansen time. I
Right.
know she's been around the program, but it does. I've never been a head coach other than like a sixth grade youth league. But I would imagine that it takes some time to adjust and make that shift. And I would imagine she took over, and there's probably some things she wanted to change,
Yeah.
and that's going to take some time. So I'm not saying I'm not sitting here on January 21st and saying they're going to miss the tournament. Just saying they are the last team in the field, according to Charlie Cream right now. Big week for Iowa. I think at this point, every week's going to be big for them. But they've got to find a way. They stay out west. They're at Washington. Really important game for them to try and get a road win against another bubble team that could give you a little bit of an edge over them in the Big Ten standings, in the NCAA bubble standings. And I know as we at IU get ready to go out west, we've lost 2 in a row now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's you bring a losing streak onto a 6-day road trip. That's a lot. And
Yeah.
so now you in Iowa brought a 4-game losing streak, and they lose the first one out there. So now you've got a lot of time here where you're sitting around getting ready for that Washington game away from home. And I would imagine trying to do some team bonding stuff, trying to get morale up, keep the confidence up, but that's difficult. So I think a pretty important game tomorrow night for Iowa against Washington.
And I was going to say, and it's a good Washington team.
Yes.
I don't fully understand the ceiling of what Washington women's basketball is, if you ask me, but they're playing, I think, around their peak in this last 7-game stretch. Like, this is really good basketball you're getting out of Ella Dean, you're getting out of Savia Sellers. Sellers had a monster game just the other night.
Yep.
This team is clicking on all cylinders is really what I'm just trying to say is they're playing some of their best basketball that they can here recently. So it's a tough challenge for Iowa, but I also wanted to mention, Austin, since we said some of the individual players, for Iowa, Lucy Olson also has a ton of experience, but the experience came not at Carver Hawkeye. I mean, she had an All-American career at Villanova, comes over to Iowa this season. Here recently, she's been struggling a bit. She averages like 16 points a game, though, for the season. I think in that loss to Oregon, she had 4 points, 2 of 12 from the floor. If she can get some traction and get back to scoring the way that she has throughout her entire career, I mean, she was averaging over 20 a game at Villanova, one of the country's leading scorers. If she finds a way to get back to that, I think that can swing the needle a bit for Iowa, but right now it's just an if and see if she can get out of the struggle and when it happens.
Well, a team that had probably the biggest roller coaster of a week was Illinois. Let's start with them on Thursday. They come on the road in a place they hadn't won in 13 years, and they beat Indiana in Assembly Hall 68-54. This was a thorough beatdown, to be honest with you, Dalton. This was dominated from start to finish. Illinois jumped out of the gates to a big lead, and Indiana did get it down, I believe, to 4 in the fourth quarter and could not get over that hump. And Terry Morin just said that she did mention that they had a bad lead in practice, which coaches will usually tell you if you have a couple of bad practices, you don't have a great feeling about the upcoming game. To be honest, Illinois was just the more physical, tougher team in this game. And we could talk about Indiana's response in a minute because I thought they played like a physical and tough team against USC.
Mm-hmm.
But in this game, Illinois brought it. Adalia McKenzie goes for 11 points in the opening quarter and just kind of sets the tone. They also didn't miss coming out of the gates, and Indiana's all of a sudden in like an 11-point hole, and you're like, what just happened? But you and I were texting about it. I think Kendall Bostic just you don't even realize it, and then you look up at the board, and she's got 21 and 8, and you're like, gosh, that was really easy. Like and she has great finishing ability around the rim, great touch, good footwork. She put up a double-double, 20 and 14 in the loss to Michigan State, but she's so undervalued, and she's had to play basically 40 minutes every night ever since several of these players have gone down with injuries. So she's playing almost every minute of every game. Same with Genesis Bryant, same with Adalia McKenzie. But the player I want to shout out, Barry Wallace, in this game was absolutely huge. You texted me, said, man, Barry had a heck of a game. She hit a dagger 3. So Indiana cut it to 4, and then it became 7. And then I think Barry Wallace hit like a free throw, a layup, and then a just dagger 3 in the corner that took the lead back to double digits. And she was ready for the moment on the road. The crowd was getting loud. Hoosiers were coming back, and Barry Wallace was not fazed.
It's amazing, too, because in doing the prep work for Illinois, Michigan State, because that was Illinois' next game, I wrote down, okay, Barry Wallace, 62 career points, 13 against Indiana. Because, she just exploded there in Bloomington. And I thought it really maybe helped give some relief to the Illini, just because, again, they got the news at the same time that Micaiah Cook and Gretchen Dolan were going to be out for the season. That's 22, 23 points a night. That's just wiped off the rotation. And so now you're like, okay, well, they're going to play 6 players. And Barry Wallace is that 6th player in the rotation that's really going to see time. And then for them to pick off a win against Iowa first, a ranked Iowa team at the time, and then go to Assembly Hall in Bloomington and get that win, it really kind of showed you something about Illinois. I wouldn't read too much into the Michigan State-Illinois result if you're trying to grade the Illini. I think just in general, the way Michigan State plays is a bad matchup for Illinois. And I think Michigan State was able to rightfully take advantage. And Michigan State played closer to its capabilities and potential than it had in recent games. And so I don't think it's as much about Illinois as much as that was about Michigan State in that game. So if you're trying to grade and you're trying to figure out where teams go in the hair splitting, I wouldn't dock Illinois much. And they kept this close for a long time. This game was at 10 points for the longest time for Michigan State and Illinois. And then finally, it was, I want to say, 3 turnovers in 40 seconds. And Theron Halleck just went on a 6-0 run herself. And you looked up and you're like, oh, they're up 18 now. Theron Halleck had 17 points in the 4th quarter alone for Michigan State. It's the most ever scored by a Spartan in the 4th quarter. 17 points in that quarter. She had a career high 26. But that, to me, was much more about what that game is. So if we're staying on the subject of Illinois, I think the future is still fairly bright for them, even without Cook and Dolan. I just think they ran into a tough matchup for them in Michigan State.
Yeah, big week for them in the sense of confidence building to keep this going, because they beat Iowa. They go on the road. They beat Indiana. They lose to Michigan State, but now you get Northwestern and Rutgers this week, I believe. No, Northwestern and Purdue. 2 teams that have not won yet of the Big Ten. So if you're Illinois, this is an opportunity. You're 3-4 in the conference to get over 500, to get some more confidence going in. And you mentioned Michigan State being a bad matchup for Illinois. Illinois has been a bad matchup for Indiana under Shauna Green. And I mean, we have had some dog fights in those games in Bloomington. And last year in Champaign, Illinois just took it to Indiana. And so this is now 2 straight. Then the last 2, so what is that, 80 minutes of play between these 2 teams. Illinois has outscored Indiana by 34. So Illinois has brought it to the Hoosiers here over the last 2 matchups. Hadn't beaten Indiana. I believe it was 17 straight wins for the Hoosiers in the matchup. And now they've won 2 straight. So give Illinois a lot of credit. They came in. They played really well. I thought Indiana showed a lot of resolve against USC. in the next game. It was there for the Hoosiers. They were up 11 in the second quarter, which when you're facing a team like USC, you got to be up probably 20 to 25 points to ever feel really safe about it.
Right.
It was the smallest 11-point lead I've ever seen. Like in the sense of like Indiana was playing great and they were hitting shots and they were playing awesome defense, but you just knew there was something that was going to happen. And by the end of the half, Indiana was down 6. I mean, it was a 17-point swing in about 6 minutes of game time. But I call this out because I saw a list a few weeks ago. I don't know who it was from, but it was like best defenders in the Big Ten.
Mm-hmm.
And Chloe Moore McNeil was not on it. And I want to stand up here for Chloe because she should be, if you ever see a list of best defensive players in the Big Ten that does not have Chloe Moore McNeil on it, in my opinion, you throw that list away. I don't think that's a good list. Juju Watkins really struggled in the first half of this game, had 1 point in the first quarter, ended 6 of 16 on the day. And that's a mixture of both Chloe Moore McNeil and Lexus Bargesser. Both did a tremendous job on her. But I've been so impressed by the way she's defended Lucy Olson. And on the second half against Adalia McKenzie, they switched her on to McKenzie, and she didn't score, I think, one basket in the second half for McKenzie. And the way she played Juju Watkins and the way she played Kiki Rice, who I think was like 3 of 12 in the game against Indiana. So the Hoosiers have it figured out defensively. The offense has got to get going. Having Yarden Garzone go 3 of 17 from the floor and 2 of 11 from 3 on a day where she got a lot of good looks. That's tough. She has hit, I think, 3 of like 17 3-pointers against USC and UCLA. So I expect her. She's somebody who it's not going to linger with. She's going to figure it out. But both games, when I've talked to coaches afterwards, they're like, look, we did what we needed to do, just couldn't hit the shots. So, and again, as I've explained, if they don't lose to Illinois, you play that way against USC and you come out with a really optimistic look at things. You're sitting at 5-2 in the conference right now, and you feel pretty good. But because you lost on Thursday the way you did to Illinois, you felt like you needed to come back and win this one, which isn't the most realistic of expectations against a national title team. So it was just one of those like, okay, played great, couldn't get the win though, and man, would that have helped.
And that's completely fair. I was curious. I was looking while you were talking about it. I hadn't seen that list of Big Ten defensive players. I got a shout out, but it's a good mention for Chloe Moore McNeil. But I mean, I trust you, Austin, because again, I was working during this one as you were during the Michigan State Illinois kind of back and forth. But it just seemed like Indiana was up early, and to your point, based on all the commentary I had read as well, just didn't get buckets towards the end. It seems as simple as that. And again, to your point, you're talking about a national championship contender in USC. The fact that you're even in this game and in position to hit some shots and maybe pull off the upset, that's a good sign for the Hoosiers and Terry Morin.
Yeah, 4 of 13, 31% in the fourth quarter for Indiana from the floor. They scored the first 5. So I think the big momentum shifter, and Indiana goes on this big run of the third quarter. They take a 50-48 lead. They miss a shot with about 5 seconds left to stretch it to 4. Juju goes down the floor and hits like a 35-footer to take the lead into the fourth quarter. So all that work of the comeback to get the lead by 2, and then this deep 3-pointer from Juju gives them the lead right back. I'm like, gosh dang it. And then Indiana scores the first 5 points of the fourth quarter, and they're up 55-51, and the offense just kind of went stale. And then they make one more run, and we know basketball is a game of runs, and they cut it to 70-66. Then it's 71-66, and Garzone gets 2 good looks, one a fadeaway on the baseline and one a wide open 3. Doesn't make either one of them, and USC wins by 7. But I'm with you. I think more positives in a vacuum from that game than negatives. But I think a pivotal game on Friday with Oregon, starting that Pacific Northwest trip, because you want to snap that losing streak. You want to get morale up. If you're going to be on the road for 6 days, You want to get that first win. Just makes everything a little bit easier. Makes the sightseeing more fun in Seattle while you're killing time before that game on Monday. But important week coming up for Indiana. Outside of that, we should shout out Michigan. A really nice win for the Wolverines over Washington. This feels like a while ago, but they beat the Huskies 82-69. Just kind of stiff-armed them the whole way. Washington could never really get all too close. Despite, as you said, Xavier Sellers with 30 points in this game. Michigan was terrific, so we should certainly shout them out. Yeah. You texted me before we went on today and said we're going to be really boring. We have the exact same power rankings, so let's put them up here on the screen. That's where we stand. We were obviously different last week, so some of the movement is different. But yes. I think you nailed it on the head earlier. 1 and 2 have started to separate from 3 and 4 just a little bit. Now, when Maryland was at its healthiest, they gave USC everything they could handle. Yes. But we can no longer view Maryland, I think, in that same context because Bree McDaniel's now out for the year. Cheyenne Sellers is hurt. And so I don't doubt that Brenda Freese will make the most out of what she has, but I don't think they're the same Maryland team that played USC 2 weeks ago. So I do think there's a pretty big line there between 2 and 3. Agreed. You could have convinced me either way on 3 and 4. I had it this way after the Ohio State loss. And then last night I'm watching that Texas game and I'm like, I feel like eye test would tell you to bump Ohio State up, but they're playing, it's their first game without McDaniel. Sellers goes out. Maybe that's not serious. Maybe she's fine. So I gave Maryland the benefit of the doubt heading into a really big week where 3 and 4 are going to play each other. And then 3 and 1 are going to play each other. So we're going to learn and get a little bit more clarity in that top 4 by our next show.
And the logic I used, Austin, is simply that, look, Maryland obviously did not look good, and we don't know. Sellers could be back. We have no idea, no information really on Cheyenne Sellers, but they lost to a team that can go to the Final Four in Texas. Yep. Like, Texas is that kind of talented this season. Ohio State losing to Penn State, it just felt like it needed to be punished more than drubbed by a Final Four caliber type squad, where you gave up the first Big Ten loss, the first Big Ten win of the season for Penn State came at the hands of your expense and your first loss of the year for Ohio State.
I agree. And I think Ohio State, they take care of business at home against Maryland this week, and they go to Nebraska and they win that game. Boom, they're right back in the conversation of the top 3 in this league. It's all about opportunities, and there's plenty of them left. 5, Michigan State stays steady for both of us. I had an inkling in my head of maybe bumping Nebraska over Michigan State before Sunday, and then Michigan State. So I do value tiebreakers in the sense of head-to-head matchups. So a lot of people will say, well, then why is Nebraska 6 and Michigan State 5? The eye test of watching Michigan State against Illinois was like, yeah, that's a really good basketball team disposing of a really good basketball team on their home floor. Yeah. So I felt like Michigan State didn't deserve to drop on a 2-0 week where they went on the road and beat a good Illinois team.
So I agree with you, even though obviously it's going to be easy to point out that I call the games for Michigan State women's basketball. So if you want to call bias, feel free to call bias. There is a bias involved. But I'm with you in the sense of continuing the theme from earlier. When we talk about certain teams are just a bad matchup with play style for other teams, Nebraska is a bad matchup for Michigan State. And obviously Michigan State lost to them this year. They lost to them last year twice. It's the only team besides Ohio State they lost to twice last year. They lost to them in the first Big Ten game of the season, then they lost to them in the Big Ten tournament. It's just a hard matchup for the way Michigan State plays with Nebraska. It's a specific issue, I think, to the Huskers. But to your point, that crowd at Illinois, too, that was the largest attended crowd for the Illini this season. They had around 6,000. It was loud in there, and Michigan State went in and take care of business on that Sunday afternoon against the Illini. I'm with you. I thought that should put them ahead of Nebraska, but I could absolutely entertain the conversation.
Yeah, and Nebraska wasn't even on my top 9 2 or 3 weeks ago, and now, I mean,
how quickly things change.
They have risen quite a bit. Michigan and Illinois jump in for me. You had Michigan in last week.
Yep.
My big thing with Michigan was they hadn't beaten anybody.
Yep.
And they take care of business this week against Washington, which I was extremely impressed by. And then Rutgers as well on Saturday. Huge week for Michigan. They go at Minnesota tomorrow, and then Saturday, the Michigan State rivalry between Spartans and Wolverines is going to be must-watch TV Saturday afternoon. So that's that. It's a big week for Michigan, but I think they deserve to be in that top 9. Their losses are all to the best teams in this conference. They haven't tripped up against somebody they shouldn't have. They've lost to UCLA, USC, and Ohio State. So it's hard to punish a team like that.
Completely agreed. And I feel like Michigan and Minnesota, we've talked about this some before too, Austin, is those two we're still waiting to see be a really good team. Mm-hmm. But they also don't lose to bad teams. Yeah. Like they take care of business, and we're waiting to kind of see maybe what the ceiling or whatever is. Michigan getting that win over Washington, I think that was one of the first ones where you're like, okay, we know what Washington is about, at least here in the recent weeks where they've been playing so well. That tells you something about Michigan. But those two playing against each other this week, that's really exciting for me to see how that one shakes out.
Look, I've said it on the show before. If I spent all football season saying wins matter for IU football, then wins have to matter in women's basketball.
Yeah,
okay, you gotta. If you take care of the teams you're supposed to take care of, there's value in that.
Absolutely.
And that again, Ohio State just lost to Penn State, but Michigan has continued to take care, and Minnesota as well. Minnesota escaped danger against Northwestern, but they do get the win. They stay in there at number 8, and Illinois jumps in with that nice road win over Indiana at 9. It was between Illinois and Indiana for me at that 9 position, and you just can't put Indiana in there right now because of the way that Illinois dominated them, and it's so fresh in our minds just 5 days ago. Now, if Indiana goes and sweeps the Pacific Northwest this week, then we can have a conversation about putting them right back in there. Yep. Oregon is another team that I feel like is just kind of sitting there. Like they're there, and I don't know what to do with them quite yet. They're 5-3 in the Big Ten right now. A nice win over Iowa. Otherwise, they've kind of taken care of the bottom of the league that they've played. But I'm very curious to see where Oregon goes from here, because as I've been preparing for them, this is not an Oregon team that, like Deja Kelly, we have seen her be a star at North Carolina, but she's averaging just 11 points a game. It's a different role for her this year. They just attack you with depth. And they have 10, 11 people, maybe even 12 sometimes that will play in a game, and a bunch of players that average 4 to 8 points a game that are capable of giving you 14 to 16 points on a given night, and that's the difference. So I'm intrigued by what Kelly Graves has at Oregon. They were a huge unknown in the preseason because they were a whole new team, brought in a ton of new transfers. And I think even on January 21st, they remain a bit of an enigma about what they are, and I'll get to see them firsthand on Friday. I'm curious to see how that game goes, because I would say Indiana, Washington, and Oregon are the 3 right on the outside of this power rankings trying to knock their way in, and they're all going to play each other in some form or fashion coming up this week.
And that's going to be a lot of fun to see, and I'm with you. The Ducks' depth is kind of staggering and maybe just mystifying, just because they lost a lot in the portal, and a lot of it is here in the Big Ten. Grace Van Sluten at Michigan State, Chance Gray at Ohio State. Like, they lost a lot of talent from last year. So for them to replenish with so much depth has been kind of like are we sure this is real? Like, you're just kind of making sure and wanting to validate it. But off to a great start. And what's funny too, Austin, as you mentioned, Indiana, Washington, Oregon, some range of 10 through 12. And I'm completely in agreement with you. That puts Iowa at 13 at this point. And I think we both would have them at 13. We don't have them pushing, like we kind of talked about earlier with the Wisconsins and the class below, maybe to even miss the Big Ten tournament. But Iowa being at 13 is just kind of a staggering thing to say at the time.
It's crazy to think when you look at these lists, there have to be some schools around the conference who are like, man, Indiana and Iowa finally take a step back. But we just add these LA schools into the mix, and boom, they take the top. Because It's been Indiana, Iowa, and Ohio State at the top of the league for the last 3 years, and sprinkle Maryland in there as well. And for Iowa and Indiana to both be taking a step back, you feel like would open the conference up a little bit, but it has basically just opened it up for the LA schools to take 1 and 2. I can't wait till they play because I've seen them both now, and I would say that UCLA is a tick better, in my opinion, but I want to see them play because they are just stylistically very different teams, and I'm interested to see how that's going to play out. Let's talk about what we're going to see this week. Some big games this week. My initial game of the week was the one on Sunday between UCLA and Maryland, just rankings-wise, but I'm a little bit with the injuries and the kind of unknowns. I almost think it's Ohio State at Nebraska. I think that might be my most intriguing game of the week as a team. In terms of the Big Ten standings, that has huge implications. And that one, to me, is the one I would circle as like, that's a game I feel like is going to have some real big implications.
And I agree with you. I think Ohio State, Nebraska is going to be big. But if Sellers is back, again, because we have no idea if she's back and healthy now or if she's gone for a while, that Maryland-Ohio State game, I think, gets real intriguing if Sellers is indeed healthy to go for that game, because that one will have some implications too. Because I think even with Bree McDaniel being gone, and I think Bree McDaniel is a tremendous player. This is not in any way kind of a slight. It's just that Brenda Frese has so much depth with that Maryland team. I think they can find a way to survive. But if you lose Sellers, we start having other conversations about how the Terps can try and manage. And they still would have plenty of pieces, right? You'd still have Schmeichel. You'd still have Kubek. You'd still have Poffenbarger. You'd still have Tibiasu running the point. Like, there's still a lot of pieces with that Terps team. But if Sellers is back and ready, I think that's a big game. Also, I mean, we talked about it a little bit ago, but Michigan State and Michigan matching up on Saturday afternoon in a top 25 game, that one is going to be wild.
The fun part of this schedule is that from the 22nd, which is tomorrow, through Monday, there's a game worth watching every single day. So you're going to start tomorrow with a really good 3 games. With that Penn State coming off the win, how do they handle the success on the road at Michigan State? The Michigan-Minnesota game, which just has such big implications on the middle of the Big Ten. 2 teams trying to prove it. And then Iowa, a desperate Iowa team on the road at Washington. And then you've got the standalone game Thursday, Maryland at Ohio State. For those listening on the podcast, just kind of explaining the graphic. And then Friday, it's Indiana at Oregon. 2 teams in the middle of the conference trying to separate themselves. Then you mentioned Saturday, Michigan State at Michigan. What an awesome game that's going to be. I think you get to say hi to our great usher. I think his name's Don. It's always
Don!
up in our section. I love Don.
If there was a yearly award for a host in the Big Ten Conference, Don at Michigan would win.
Yeah, it's Don. If you're listening, Don, we love your hospitality that you give us up there at the Chrysler Center. Excited to get back up there here in February. But and then Sunday, I highlighted Rutgers Penn State because that has huge implications on Big Ten tournament. As Rutgers looks for its first win in the conference. Penn State, a second win with some of these teams that haven't won at all yet is going to be pretty big heading into February if they can grab another win there. And then, I mean, UCLA, Maryland speaks for itself. We've talked about Ohio State, Nebraska, and then Monday night, Indiana at Washington. So awesome slate of games this week.
I do want to point out, too, Austin, since you mentioned some of those teams there and we haven't talked about, I mean, at the bottom of the Big Ten right now is Rutgers. They don't have a Big Ten win. A couple of games ago, Keomi McMiller, the talented freshman, came back, dropped a career-high 33 points against Nebraska in a close game that the Huskers were able to kind of survive. Then against Michigan State, put up a lot of shots, kind of had a tough day. I think she was at 13 points. It took 17 shots against the Spartans. MSU won that game. This last time out, Keomi McMiller didn't score a point, went 0 for 8 from the floor. She was 0 for 6 at halftime. Didn't play as much in the second half. I mean, that's obviously been a big headline story, has been McMiller and Rutgers throughout the season. It's taken a pretty dramatic extreme turn from 33 points to 0 points in the span of 3 games. It's something to keep an eye on in future weeks.
She has the capability of carrying them, almost carried them to a win against Nebraska. But also there's been a lot of stuff that's been going on there with her, and we don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes that led to the couple of games where she didn't play. But Rutgers could really use that win on the road at Penn State to try and give them a chance to get to the Big Ten tournament.
And a quick Big Ten player shout out for somebody who doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and because that's kind of what some of the idea and the spirit of this podcast is. Destiny Adams at Rutgers. I don't know if they win a Big Ten game this year or if they win several. I don't know how it finishes for Rutgers. I don't know if she'll get all-conference recognition because of maybe the records and how things play out. But Destiny Adams is probably a top 10 player in this conference. She averages a double-double, 18 points, 11 rebounds a game. It's right in that ballpark. She plays her tail off every night, even though they're going through a tough stretch. Destiny Adams deserves a lot more attention than what she gets.
Yeah, 2 double-doubles this week, 2 more double-doubles for her to add to what's been a terrific season for her in her second year at Rutgers. Certainly worth shouting out as well. Any parting thoughts as we kind of look at what's to come, what has been happening? We're somewhere kind of between a third of the way through the Big Ten season, not quite to the halfway mark, but we're close. By the next show, we'll essentially be halfway through, and some teams even more. Where are we at in conference right now? I think we've kind of established that there's 2 teams at the top, but to me, it feels like it's going to be really hard for anybody else to separate themselves. I think there's just going to be a ton of carnage in this league. You're going to see an Illinois go beat Indiana, but then you're going to see Indiana go beat somebody. And then you're going to see Michigan State go to Illinois and beat them. And you're going to see Nebraska beat Michigan State. And it's just going to be a lot of cannibalizing each other in the middle of this conference. And the question to me is, what is the sustainability of that in terms of making the tournament?
Yeah.
We had somebody ask us on Twitter last week, can an 8-10 team make the NCAA tournament?
Yes.
It depends on your resume, but I think there's some teams. You look at an Iowa, for example. If Iowa gets to 8-10 of the conference, that means they finish 6-4 the rest of the way. And I think Jan Jansen would probably take that.
And I think that gets you in.
And with wins over Virginia Tech and Iowa State and Drake in the non-con, you're looking at a team that could absolutely get in. And obviously lost to Tennessee, but a tight loss against a good Tennessee team. So they're one of those teams that now, if somebody like Michigan or Minnesota ends up at 8-10, or Washington, you're having a harder time there because the meat on the non-conference bone is not there. It's very exclusive to somebody like Iowa, who I think challenged themselves and won a couple of big games in the non-con. But the overall, I just feel like there's going to be so much beating each other up that I wonder how many teams at the end of the day will actually be able to get into the tournament if everybody just kind of ends somewhere between 11-7 and 9-9, or if a couple of teams start to separate both directions, and then you're looking at 9-11 teams getting in the tournament.
Well, and I'm curious of it too, because I mean, mathematically speaking, if you're looking at 2/3 of the conference, 12 of the 18 teams getting in, more than likely one of those teams will be below 500 in the Big Ten. I mean, that's just kind of how the numbers shape out. Now, I'm with you. I don't know if it holds true as it does here late January that in a month and a half that there will be 12 Big Ten teams that do stay like in the mix of that bracketology. But that part's going to be really fascinating. And the way I look at it, Austin, is if you feel down at any point, like you mentioned, there's a couple of teams that have taken some bumps and they're on some losing streaks. You used the word earlier, and I think it's perfect. Opportunities. When you're talking about a league that's as deep as that, have that many teams in bubble conversation late in January. I mean, just about every night. If you have a 3-game week, your team does. If you have 3 games in a week, more than likely 2 of them is going to be against NCAA tournament teams. And that's the actual math on it. So given that, you have all sorts of opportunities to flip around any given night and jump back up to where you want to be. And that's the really cool and exciting part about this season.
It's going to be and you also wonder what's it going to be like when you get to the NCAA tournament in terms of the stamina of some of these teams. They're just going to get beaten up for 18 games. And you think about the West Coast teams and all the travel they're going to have to make. It's fascinating. And this conference is awesome. That's why we started this podcast, because there's so much to talk about in the Big Ten. And I cannot wait to see what happens. I'll be extremely jet lagged on the next episode of this show as we get back from Oregon and Washington, but extremely excited for these trips. Have not been out to either one of the arenas out there yet. So excited to see. I've heard they're great. So I'm really excited to see them. And we'll do some schedule management, and we will talk to you next Tuesday for sure. We'll just have to figure out when it'll be. Dalton, safe travels to you. I think you're staying in the state this week, right?
Sure am.
Yep.
3 of our last 4 games have been on the road, so it's time. I'm actually not packing a suitcase for a moment. It feels weird.
You go.
Instead of you now.
Yeah, you get to be home for a game, and then you go up to, or I guess, is that down to Michigan? East to Michigan.
Yeah. We say down
side.
The road here at Michigan State.
Down the road. Yeah. Well, there you go. You're in the same state all week. That's great. We'll chat next Tuesday. A reminder: give us a like, a subscribe, a download, all that jargon that comes with podcasting. Make sure you help us out here. Ratings help us. All that stuff, downloads, etc. Join us live on Tuesdays on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. We air live there normally at noon Eastern every Tuesday, and you can always catch the video after the fact in the archives there as well. For Dalton Shetler, I'm Austin Render. Thanks so much for joining us on the Dribble Drive. Enjoy an awesome week of Big Ten basketball. I am certain we will have plenty to talk about the next Tuesday show.